Right, so the recent collapse of the Gaza ceasefire has meant the reigniting of the most well-documented genocide in history, playing out once again before all of our eyes via social media as it is. The fragile truce that was the Gaza ceasefire, which Israel repeatedly breached, had, nevertheless, offered a glimmer of hope for de-escalation and some humanitarian relief to get where it was needed. Yet even this was abused, with the most needed aid still being blocked, and ultimately all was completely shattered amid mutual accusations of violations made by both sides, but which a certain blockade of aid completely into Gaza by Israel certainly made obvious to the eyes of the world that they were certainly at fault. Israel claims that Hamas broke the ceasefire for refusing to agree to their US proposed changes to the original ceasefire agreement, while Hamas insists it remains committed to negotiations even now, as it retaliates against Israeli military actions, they having demanded that Israel stick with the original agreed-to plan to move to phase 2 of the ceasefire proposal that both sides had at one point at least accepted. The situation is once again now escalating rapidly, with Hamas's militant wing, the Qassam brigades, launching rocket strikes on Tel Aviv, marking the first such barrage since before the Gaza ceasefire began, and confirming Israel's failure to wipe them out. One of Israel's main reasons, they claimed, for going into Gaza in the way they did. So a failure on their own terms, in which case. This development by the Qassam brigades comes after 3 days of intense Israeli attacks on Gaza, which have resulted in the deaths of over 700 Palestinians. The resumption of violence has drawn global attention not only for its immediate human cost and the abject failure to negotiate a permanent peace when one side is led by a man who knows his job is on the line if he were to end atrocities, but also for the broader implications it holds for the region's stability and the prospects for a lasting and permanent peace. Right, so the Gaza ceasefire is now well and truly over, it would seem, with Hamas firing rockets into Israel, albeit while still claiming they are at the negotiating table. There was high hopes for this ceasefire, wasn't there? Given how many times Netanyahu had collapsed attempts previously to get one through. Pressure from Trump, largely responsible for it finally getting through, as we know. He wanted the positive headlines. Therefore, the foundations of it were not exactly rock solid to begin with, though. It was brokered with international mediation, sure, was intended to provide a temporary respite which would develop into something more permanent from the violence that has plagued Gaza for 15 months. The disproportionate response as that has been to a one-night incursion by Hamas, which saw them take more than 250 hostages, of which 59 remain in the Strip. A war crime, a criminal offence, and they absolutely need to be held account for that. But as a result of Israel ending the ceasefire, when their blockade of aid over 2 weeks has failed to force Hamas to give in to their changed ceasefire demands, as crafted by US envoy Steve Witkoff, they've escalated things further. But now Hamas have retaliated. Israel, of course, claims a different version of events to that, though, claiming that Hamas broke the ceasefire themselves by failing to adhere to the ceasefire terms. But in their case, the Witkoff changes to the original terms. Just because they had accepted it didn't mean everybody else had to. That's not negotiation. While Hamas asserts that it was Israel that walked away from the negotiations and resumed hostilities by refusing to keep their word and adhering to the original ceasefire plans that both sides had agreed to at one point. Hamas has vehemently denied accusations that it withdrew from those negotiations. In a statement, the group said, "We are at the heart of the negotiations and remain committed to finding a solution that ensures the rights and dignity of our people." But that, of course, stands against the backdrop of what the Hamas Qassam brigades have now done, as this excerpt from the Cradle explains. Despite over a year of brutal airstrikes and ground operations, Israeli forces failed to eradicate the resistance's military capabilities. Hamas's armed wing, the Qassam brigades, launched a barrage of rockets towards Tel Aviv on the 20th of March for the first time in months, coming after over 700 Palestinians were killed by Israel within a period of 2 days. The Qassam brigades bombarded Tel Aviv with a barrage of rockets in response to the Zionist massacres against civilians, the resistance movement announced via its Telegram channel. The Israeli army said 1 rocket was intercepted and 2 others fell in open areas. The last time the Qassam brigades or other resistance groups launched rockets at Israel was in early January, weeks before the ceasefire agreement. Over the course of 3 days, Israeli airstrikes and ground operations have reportedly killed more than 700 Palestinians, most of whom were civilians, of course, mostly women and children. The scale of the violence has drawn condemnation from international human rights organisations, which have called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and an independent investigation into potential war crimes. But this has been the call for a long time now, and it hasn't happened because Israel won't let it. Israel prefer to openly admit to what they've been doing, as these publicised army reports detail of the last couple of days. Over the past few hours, IDF troops began conducting ground activity in the area of Shabura in Rafah. As part of the activity, the troops dismantled a number of terrorist infrastructure. Simultaneously, IDF troops are continuing ground activity in northern and central Gaza. In recent months, Hamas terrorists exploited a site in northern Gaza, which previously served as the Turkish hospital, as a command and control centre, for which they directed and carried out terrorist attacks against IDF troops and the State of Israel. In response, IDF troops operated to dismantle the terrorist infrastructure at the site. Furthermore, over the last few hours, the Israeli Air Forces continued to target and dismantle terrorists and terrorist infrastructure throughout the Gaza Strip. The IDF and the Israeli Security Agency will continue to operate against terrorist organisations in the Gaza Strip in order to protect the citizens of the State of Israel. Oh, here we go again then. Hospitals are Hamas bases of operation once again, are they? The hospital referred to here was the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital, located near the Israeli-built Netzarim corridor. It has been repeatedly hit by Israeli strikes over the last few days because they went straight for it, didn't they? Amid their claims, of course, that it's all Hamas. That hospital now having been completely destroyed, like so many others. It's a blatant war crime. Hospitals are protected under international law. There's no excusing it. But when that law never gets applied to Israel, this is what happens. They have no impunity over it. Strikes on medical infrastructure by Israel is not new. It has been a consistent feature of Israel's military campaigns in Gaza, and it never elicits the response it should. Everything is Hamas as an excuse to destroy and flatten every single building that's in sight. It's quite the achievement for a movement supposedly numbering in the tens of thousands as Hamas does, and living in tunnels, as Israel claims, that virtually every building in an area, home to over 2 million people, all ends up being Hamas, isn't it? Doesn't matter if it's hospitals or schools or mosques or homes or businesses or infrastructure, everything is Hamas when all of a sudden it's convenient for Israel to announce it. But they're all living in tunnels at the same time as well, aren't they? Yeah. Okay. Fewer and fewer people continue to believe this Israeli narrative, in my view. Yet still, clearly these messages are spread to what is now hopefully a brainwashed minority, but also enables Israel supporting governments to justify their ongoing support for them. You can condemn Hamas and hold them to account for their crimes, and that is absolutely right to do so. But these Israeli actions not only violate international humanitarian law, they also exacerbate the already dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, and so they should be held to the exact same standard. The definition of terrorism, folks, after all, is the calculated use of violence, or the threat of violence, to create a general climate of fear in a population, and thereby to bring about a particular political objective. Do you tell me what is the difference between what one side is doing here and the other? Except that one lot are a designated terrorist group in many countries around the world, including the one I live in here in the UK. And if that is the case, then the other side frankly should be as well. Gaza is on the verge of famine. The blockade, which has been in place for over 2 weeks, restricts the flow of food, medicine and other essential supplies into the Gaza Strip. According to the United Nations, more than 80% of Gaza's population is relying on humanitarian aid right now to meet their most basic needs, and those supplies are running out. Only the most depraved of Zionist shills would claim otherwise. And they are. And for some reason the media always seems to highlight them too, don't they? In response to Israel's military actions, Hamas's Qassam brigades launched a rocket barrage on Tel Aviv, marking the first such attack on the city in months. While the rockets caused minimal damage and no casualties, as the reports, they underscored the group's determination to resist Israeli aggression, and above all else underscores Israel's failure to carry out one of its stated goals when it went into Gaza following October 7th, which was to eliminate Hamas. Instead, their actions have acted as more of a recruitment tool, it seems. So that's another reason for international communities and global governments supporting Israel to tell Israel to pack it in. Because if Hamas are a terrorist group that must be eliminated, their actions are doing the total opposite, clearly. Hamas's decision to target Tel Aviv has sparked a heated debate about the ethics and efficacy of these actions. Critics argue that rocket attacks on civilian areas are indiscriminate and constitute a violation of international law. Supporters, on the other hand, view them as a legitimate form of resistance against an occupying power. Is it possible to draw a clear line between legitimate resistance and acts of terrorism, though? Especially when one side here are, as is the case here in the UK, as I've said, are a designated terrorist group, and the other is ardently supported by our government. So do let me know your thoughts on that in the comments below. Israel's accusation, though, that Hamas broke the ceasefire is fraught with contradictions. While Israel claims that Hamas violated the terms of the agreement, it was Israel that unilaterally decided to extend the first phase of the ceasefire instead of moving to the second phase as agreed. This decision effectively stalled the negotiation process and undermined the trust between the two parties where there was any such thing to begin with. Hamas, for its part, has accused Israel of using the ceasefire as a pretext to consolidate its military gains and impose new conditions on the negotiations. And of course it gets Israel no nearer to the release of the rest of their hostages, not that they are seen as a priority for this most hard ride of Israeli governments by a great many people, not least those in Israel, including the families of said hostages. The collapse of the ceasefire and the resumption of violence have got far-reaching implications for the region and the rest of the world as well. This conflict has already strained relations between Israel and its allies, many of whom have expressed growing concern about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the lack of progress towards a political solution. But they need to go further than that. It's not enough in and of itself. The United States in particular has faced criticism for its unwavering support of Israel, which many see as enabling its continuation of violations of international law. That I don't expect to change whatsoever. As observers and global citizens, we have a responsibility to critically engage with these issues and challenge the narratives that perpetuate this cycle of violence wherever these narratives are being carried. This means holding both sides accountable for their actions, Israel and Hamas, the crimes committed, but there's no getting away from the difference in the scale of the atrocities committed by one side over the other. And it doesn't excuse governments around the world who are excusing one side whilst condemning the other, because that isn't helping matters one iota, and we need to challenge those narratives too. This can't work unless we get that. This can't end for as long as one side is criminalised whilst the other is supported. Any government doing that is part of the problem, not the solution, and they need to be told. We can all do our bit in that, a bit of protesting, making different choices. Protest works, after all. And here's a story that proves it. A success story for the BDS movement, boycott, divestment and sanctions, and just how high ordinary people that are part of that movement are punching and making a difference. So do check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch to find out all about that. Do also hit like, share and subscribe if you have not already done so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, and also support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. And I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.